The town of Black Hollow was a place forgotten by time. Nestled deep within a dense, shadowy forest, it was a town where the sun rarely touched the ground, and the air always carried a faint chill. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the old house at the edge of the woods, a crumbling Victorian mansion that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. They called it the Whispering House, and for good reason. Emily hadn't thought about Black Hollow in years. She had left a decade ago, vowing never to return. But when a letter arrived in the mail, a letter she never expected, it pulled her back into the town's dark embrace. The letter was from her childhood friend Sarah, who had gone missing 10 years ago. The message was short, written in a shaky hand. "Emily, come to the house. I'm still here." Against her better judgment, Emily found herself driving down the familiar winding road to Black Hollow. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. As she approached the house, her heart pounded in her chest. The mansion loomed before her, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in ivy. It was as if the house itself was waiting for her. She stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath her feet. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. As she approached the front door, a cold breeze swept past her, carrying with it a faint whisper, "Welcome home." Emily hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the rusted handle. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, and the darkness inside seemed to swallow her whole. This was the point of no return. The interior of the house was exactly as Emily remembered it, frozen in time. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, and the walls were lined with faded portraits of people she didn't recognize. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she moved through the foyer. She called out Sarah's name, her voice echoing through the empty halls. There was no response, only the sound of her own footsteps and the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath her. As she ventured deeper into the house, she noticed something strange. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to shift and dance on their own. She reached the staircase, its wooden steps warped and cracked with age. At the top of the stairs, a single door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of light, peeking through the crack. Emily climbed the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. When she reached the top, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a single chair placed in the center. On the chair was a photograph, a picture of Emily and Sarah taken on the day Sarah disappeared. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She picked up the photograph, her hands shaking. As she stared at it, she heard a faint sound behind her, a soft, rhythmic tapping. She turned around, but there was nothing there. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the walls. Emily pressed her ear against the wallpaper, and that's when she heard it. A voice, faint and muffled, but unmistakable. It was Sarah's voice. "Emily, help me." Emily stumbled back, her heart racing. The tapping continued, growing louder and more frantic. She realized with a sinking feeling that the voice wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside them. Emily's mind raced as she stared at the wall, the tapping growing louder and more frantic. Sarah's voice was faint but clear, pleading for help. Emily's instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't leave. Not now, not after hearing Sarah's voice after all these years. She grabbed a nearby candlestick, its metal cold and heavy in her hand, and began to chip away at the wallpaper. The tapping grew more urgent, as if Sarah knew Emily was close. With each strike, the wallpaper peeled away, revealing the rotting wood beneath. Finally, a small hole appeared in the wall. Emily peered inside, her heart pounding. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. Then, a pair of eyes stared back at her. Wide, terrified, and unmistakably Sarah's. "Sarah," Emily gasped, dropping the candlestick. "What happened to you? How are you?" "There's no time," Sarah interrupted, her voice trembling. "He's coming. You need to get me out of here." "Who's coming?" Emily asked. But before Sarah could answer, a loud crash echoed through the house. The floor beneath Emily shook and the air grew colder. "He's here," Sarah whispered. "Please hurry." Emily grabbed the candlestick again and began to tear at the wall with renewed urgency. The wood splintered and cracked, and soon, the hole was large enough for Sarah to crawl through. She emerged pale and trembling, her clothes tattered and her hair matted with dirt. "We need to go," Sarah said, grabbing Emily's hand. "Now!" The two women ran down the stairs, the house groaning and creaking around them. As they reached the foyer, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emily tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "There's another way out," Sarah said, pulling Emily toward the kitchen. "Through the cellar." They hurried through the dark, narrow hallway, the walls closing in around them. The air grew thicker, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Emily glanced over her shoulder, but the hallway was empty. Kitchen. They reached the kitchen. Sarah yanked open the cellar door. A cold, damp breeze wafted up from the darkness below. "Down there?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "It's the only way," Sarah said, her eyes wide with fear. "He's coming." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Emily hesitated for only a moment before following Sarah down the rickety wooden stairs. The cellar was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. "There's a door at the back," Sarah whispered. "It leads to the woods. We can lose him there." Emily nodded, her heart pounding as they stumbled through the darkness. The footsteps above grew louder, and the sound of heavy boots echoed through the house. "He's in the kitchen," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to move." They reached the back of the cellar, where a rusted metal door stood slightly ajar. Sarah pushed it open, and the two women stumbled out into the cold night air. The woods loomed before them, the trees swaying in the wind like skeletal hands reaching out to grab them. "This way," Sarah said, pulling Emily deeper into the forest. As they ran, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches clawing at the sky. The sound of footsteps followed them, growing louder with each passing moment. "We're almost there," Sarah said, her voice strained. "Just a little further." But, as they reached a clearing, Sarah suddenly stopped. Emily turned to her, confused. "What's wrong?" Emily asked. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her eyes wide with terror. Emily followed her gaze and felt her blood run cold. Standing in the clearing was a figure, tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness. It stepped forward and the moonlight revealed its face. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was Sarah. But how could that be? Sarah was standing right beside her. Emily turned to her friend, but the woman beside her was no longer Sarah. Her face twisted into a grotesque smile, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure said, its voice echoing through the clearing. Emily stumbled back, her mind reeling. The figure lunged at her and everything went black. When Emily opened her eyes, she was back in the house. The walls were closing in around her, the air thick with the scent of decay. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, as if weighed down by an invisible force. The figure stood before her, its face shifting and changing. One moment it was Sarah, the next it was a stranger, and then it was no one at all. "Who are you?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The figure leaned in close, its breath cold against her skin. "I am the house," it said, "and you are mine." Emily's mind raced as she struggled to make sense of what was happening. The house was alive, and it had been feeding on the souls of those who entered. Sarah had been its prisoner for years, and now Emily was trapped as well. "Let me go," Emily pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "You came willingly," it said. "You opened the door. There's no escape." Emily's heart sank as she realized the truth. The letter, the voice, the tapping. It had all been a trap. The house had lured her back, and now it would never let her go. But as the figure reached for her, Emily felt a surge of defiance. She wouldn't give up without a fight. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not yours." With all her strength, she pushed against the invisible force holding her down. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You can't escape," it hissed, but its voice was weaker now. Emily stood, her body trembling but determined. She turned and ran, the house groaning and shaking around her. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, the hallway endless. But Emily didn't stop. She ran until she reached the front door, her hand trembling as she grabbed the handle. "You'll never leave." The figure's voice echoed behind her. Emily took a deep breath and pulled the door open. The cold night air rushed in, and she stumbled out into the darkness. The house let out a final deafening groan before falling silent. Emily collapsed onto the ground, her body shaking with exhaustion. She had escaped, but as she looked back at the house, she knew it wasn't over. The house was still there, waiting for its next victim, and somewhere inside, Sarah's voice whispered, "Help me." Emily never returned to Black Hollow. She moved far away, trying to forget the horrors she had witnessed. But no matter how far she went, she could never escape the feeling that the house was still watching her. Years passed, and the memory of that night faded into a distant nightmare. But one day, as Emily sorted through her mail, she found a letter. The envelope was old and worn, the handwriting familiar. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words scrawled in a shaky hand. "Emily, come to the house, I'm still here." Emily stared at the letter, her heart pounding. She knew she should throw it away, burn it, forget it ever existed. But as she looked out the window, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was the outline of a house. A crumbling Victorian mansion, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. The whispering house had found her again.
Thank you for unlocking another tale from the Vault of Tales. Like, share, and subscribe for more immersive journeys. Let us know your thoughts in the comments.